Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be painting up all the Necrons from the box set that have a glowy sword. Now after assembly and all that, I'm going to remove the pegs from the bottom. These actually got in the way of what I tried to do with the bases. Now for round 2 of trying to get the bases looking good, I decided to instead go and get some Play-Doh from Walmart, and they didn't have it. So I found some Crayola Play-Doh from Michael's nearby. So with Milliput and Play-Doh, I'm going to mix it together. Now before I used like a plaster of Paris kind of thingy, and it made the ground very grainy. However, with these two together, it makes a very smooth mixture. And it really was a lot easier to work with, it didn't crack at all, and it was much softer when I was working it. So with a 1-to-1 mix of Play-Doh to Milliput, I then applied it all over to the bases and then used the wheel on it. When I finally got a good imprint, I then took a razor blade and shaved off all the excess around the edges. While the putty was still soft, I then took the model and pressed it in lightly to make indents where its legs are going to be. This is going to be important for later. Now after I have done this to every single base and applied them to every base, there was a little bit left over. It's always good to keep the leftover of your putty of whatever you're using so that you can test it later to see if it's fully hardened, because if the test piece is hardened, then the parts you cast are now fully hard. And so with some Liquitex modeling putty, I'm going to use this and apply this to the edges of all the bases, because when I cut it with the razor knife, it looked terrible. So I'm going to use this to try to smooth out the edges. After that has dried, we're going to go and use Dawnstone, and we're going to apply this all over the base. We want to get a nice, simple, consistent color. And then with Black Templar contrast paint, we're going to apply this all over the bases as well. And once that is done, we're going to go and take Dawnstone and we're going to dry brush all over the base again. Alright, now with some Tesseract Glow, we're going to fill in every single crevice in the base, except for those that are indented by the feet of each of the models. And now with Moot Green, we're going to fill in the crevices that are left up. The Tesseract Glow from before would have created maybe like a little light dusting around the edges. So we're going to use this and we're going to fill the center of each crevice as best we can. Alright, and now we're going to use some Pallid Witch Flesh and we're going to mix it with Moot Green 1-to-1. And we're not going to fill in everything, we're basically going to try to pick out certain areas where we want it to be lighter than the others. Basic idea is if there's a crevice that's very big and thick, we want to lighten that more, as like there's more room for light to come through. If an area is very tiny or stuff, we don't want to highlight that. So use your best judgment on it. And now with Caliban Green, Lauren Forest, and Snarsnake Green, we are going to paint all the swords. Now we're going to start off with a base layer of Caliban Green all over the swords. And with the powers of an airbrush and some water mixed in, we're going to take Lauren Forest and we are going to apply this to certain parts of the sword. So we're going to focus on the front part of each of the blades. And we're going to do either the lighter areas in the middle or towards the edges of the blade. And then with Snarsnake Green, we're going to apply this much lighter highlight into the middle of where we put the Lauren Forest. And in some places I overdid it. But, so we're going to apply this in some parts of the blade. There'll be the light will be in the center, and other parts the light will be at the edges, or at the top and bottom. Alright, now we're going to tape up the swords. Now I'm going to use a very special type of tape called frog tape. I picked it up at Home Depot, but basically this is a special type of paint that doesn't allow paint to seep through the edges. It has like a special seal, and it's very good for this kind of work for taping up so that the paint doesn't flow through. However, there is one small weakness. It has a very weak grip, so if you cut it into tiny pieces, it's not going to adhere as well to the model. And this actually comes back to bite me, because I'm recording this after the fact, and that weak grip actually screws me over. I cut the tape into small thin strips, which now looking back is a bad idea. I should have done them thicker, and so they could bend over backwards back onto each other for a stronger grip. But basically I use this, and I'm going to tape the front half of each of the blades, except for one of the characters. I'm not going to do that. Now with the front half of the blades covered up, I'm going to actually do something slightly different. I'm going to try painting the whole blade Lauren Forest first. And then I'm going to take Snarsnake Green, the lightest color, and then I'm going to spray it out. Now if you notice that there is a patch of tape in the center of each of the blades that is going straight out, this is actually a marker, and the side where the tape is attached to is where I'm supposed to put a middle flare or metal piece. This way the light or the colors contrast. There's light in the center and there's light on the edges. This way there is light in the center on one half of the blade and light on the edges on the other side of the blade to add some more contrast in the colors there. You'll see when that's done. And then I go to Caliban Green and then I spray this on either the edges or the center. And now for the big reveal. And we see where the tape wasn't gripped on so well actually let stuff slide in because it wasn't gripped on well. But as for the parts where it was gripped on well, there's a thin line where the paint caked a little, it seems. So that's a little disappointing, but that's something that can be smoothed out with your fingers once it dries up a bit. And also, we'll take care of that painting later. And now with Ironbreaker, my go-to paint for this entire Indomitus box, I'm going to use this and I'm going to carefully paint all the metal pieces around the blade. I want to take my time with this, so we're going to use a fine brush and we're just going to go around all the details on every single blade. And once that is done, what we're going to do is we're going to take some frog tape and we're going to wrap the entire blade and the surrounding area up. The reason is because I'm going to paint the rest of the model Ironbreaker, but with a bigger brush, and some stuff is going to splash and I don't want to ruin the paint job. I then apply Ironbreaker to the entirety of every single model. And then I remove the tape. Now we're going to move on to painting each group. Starting with the Skorpekh destroyers, starting with them, I'm going to use a black Templar contrast, and I'm going to carefully paint the contrast on all the metal pieces next to the blade first, and then I'm going to use it and I'm going to paint all the joint hinges, the spine, I don't know how to describe it. Basically his joints and his spine and stuff with black Templar contrast. So now with Black Templar Contrast, Ironbreaker, and Dawnstone, we're going to do the little bases or base details at their feet. We're going to start by coating the entire thing in Black Templar Contrast paint. Once that's done, we're going to take our good dry brush and we're going to dry brush the base with the Dawnstone all over. We want it to match the bases themselves, so we want them to have a similar color, like broken black stone. And once that's done, we're going to dry brush Ironbreaker onto the metal beam and stuff there. And now with Golem and Flesh and Technical Contrast Medium, this time we're going to try mixing it in a 1-to-1. So we're going to take this and we're going to apply this all over the silver parts of the model, except for the shoulder pads, the head, and he has these little pistons under his legs. And now with Agrak's Earthshade, we're going to apply this to his head, his shoulder pads, things underneath that, and the pistons as well. And now we dry brush the whole model with Ironbreaker. Now be very careful around the blades. We're going to carefully dry brush it. We want to do a light dry brushing on the black and, well, the model. So this is basically just a light dry brushing all over. We want to make sure the edges are shiny and nice. And now with Pure Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to apply this all over the model, except the head and shoulder pads, but we are going to apply a little bit on the cheeks of the face and on the shoulder pads, just like to add onto the edges of the crests and stuff like that. And once again, we're going to go back and with our Guilliman Flesh and Technical Contrast Medium mix 1:1, and we're going to apply this on like the lower halves of each of the arm and leg pieces or the centerpiece. We're going to use this a little bit on the chest piece. This is where you kind of use your artsy self and you add it. You're not going to cover the whole model in it. You're going to cover like less than half, 40 to 50% of the model in it. And as far as the shoulder pads, we're going to add just a little bit onto the crests on the top, just a little bit. And now with Caliban Green, Tesseract Glow, Moot Green, and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to start doing all the glow effects. But first with Caliban Green, we're going to take a very thin, precise brush, and we're going to take the Caliban Green and we're going to paint it directly into the recesses of the blade. Now once you put it in, there might a little bit of a spill over, but because these are recesses, you can brush it with your finger and stuff, and you will clean up the area around the area so it'll only be in the recesses. And then with Tesseract Glow, we're going to apply this all into all the glowing areas. We want to paint a thin ring around each of the spots that are going to glow, and we want to fill in the places with the glow. Once that is done, we're going to take our Moot Green and we're going to fill in all the orbs and glowing spots with Moot Green. We want to fill the entirety of the orb, but we don't want it to spill over into the surrounding areas. We're not painting the eyes yet either. And then with a 1:1 mix of Pallid Witch Flesh and Moot Green, we're going to apply this to all the orbs. Now with this, we want to paint like 90% of the orb this, 90 to 100% maybe even. Your choice. And with a very fine brush, we will also paint the eyes here. And then with a 1 part Moot Green and 2 parts Pallid Witch Flesh, we will paint the orbs a final highlight color. We will cover maybe 60 to 80% of the orbs, your choice, but we wanted to cover the uppermost raised areas. And then going back with some Caliban Green, we're going to fix up some of the dark areas on the blade where the tape was loose and letting color. And then with Snarsnick Green and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to do a 1:1 mix, and we're going to apply this on all the edges of the blade. You want a very thin amount of paint for this, and I progressively get better throughout this video on this since I practice. But this is the first attempt and I'm a little blotchy. But you want a very fine brush, you want to have a good control of your paint, and you want to paint thin lines on pretty much everything. Now that little ridge that was in the center earlier from caked on paint won't be an issue because this line will basically just cover it up and people won't see it. And now with Carrick Stone and Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to paint this tiny little skull that's on the base of one of the characters. This is actually a pretty good skull mixture. We're going to start off with Carrick Stone and just coat the thing in it. After that, once it dries with the help of a hairdryer, we will then apply a simple layer of Skeleton Horde Contrast. Make sure there's enough that it builds up little pools on it so you can see the recesses and such. And then once that dries, with a little bit of help from a hairdryer, we're then going to apply Carrick Stone again on the raised bone areas, edges and stuff. Use up and down strokes to make sure the color blends in well. With those guys done, we're moving on to the Plasmancer. Okay, we're gonna use the we're gonna paint black Templar contrast all over the metal parts around the blade. Well, some of them. We're gonna paint it along his spine, his joints and such. We're also gonna paint, like, I don't know how to put it, like these vials that are coming out the back of his head, and I believe the base as well. And now with Agrax Earthshade and Magos Purple Contrast Paint, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Agrax Earthshade and we're going to paint his shoulder pads, his face, and his robes, metal cape, really weird necklace. I don't know what this is. And once that's done, we're going to go back with Magos Purple and we're going to paint his robes, cloak, necklace thing. Then we're going to apply a dry brush all over the body. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that we're also applying the Agrax Earthshade and such all over pretty much his entire body that isn't black, because he's painted noticeably different than the other models. He doesn't have that brown Guilliman flesh look to him at all. And now with Dawnstone, a step we should have done earlier, but we're going to go and we're going to dry brush his base, the stone part of it. And with Magos Purple, what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to get water down like 1-to-1, Magos Purple and water, and just apply it to the top half of each of these cloak scale things. Yeah, the top half, so the bottom half will be more pure. And now with Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to apply this all over the body and on his facial cheeks and like on ridges of his backpack shoulders and such and such. And now with Tesseract Glow, Moot Green, and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to paint the glowy parts. We're going to start off with Tesseract Glow, and we're going to apply this all over the orb, and a little bit onto the surrounding area to spill over. Now with pure Moot Green, we're going to completely fill in each of the orbs, the eyes, and such and such. Now as for those little things on his back, we're going to apply the Moot Green into the dot and in the surrounding area. If it spills over, just go back with some Black Templar Contrast to clean it up. And with 1-to-1 Moot and Pallid Witch Flesh, we're going to apply it onto the orbs, eyes, and such and such. Now, we're going to apply it to about 80 to 90% of the eye, the upper raised area, or the place, or the parts of the eyes and orbs that are more towards the north top. As well as, don't forget the cables. I forgot to mention it before, but we're applying it. All their cables and stuff in their bodies and such are also glowing. And now with 1 part Moot and 2 parts Pallid, we're going to apply this mix to probably 60 to 80% of the orbs or eyes, focusing on the higher raised areas and the little spines on his backs, and for a small portion of the tube. Basically, the closer to the center of the tubes, the lighter they're going to be. And and now with carrick stone and skeleton horde contrast, we're going to paint the little skull that's down there. And this is actually a pretty good mix. It's a nice, bright, clean skull, which would match their weapons and stuff since they reduce all organic matter out of the place. With a 1-to-1 mix of pallid witch flesh and snarsenic green, we're going to use this and we're going to highlight all the edges of his blade. Now for something like this, you're going to really need a very fine and thin brush. You're also going to have to make sure that your brush, basically after mixing the paint, you want to clean your brush and then just dip it lightly in to the paint mix and make sure you can draw out a nice sharp point with it. Alright, once that's done, we're going to take his base and we're going to add super glue all over the indent we made, and we're going to apply him onto it. Alright, now moving on to the... darn it. Overlord. We're going to take black templar contrast and we're going to apply it all basically on his joints, on a lot of the metal parts near the blade, his spine, and such and such. And with a 1-to-1 mix of Guilliman flesh and technical contrast, we're going to apply this all over his body except for his shoulder pads, his face. And then with Agrex Earthshade, we're going to apply it all over his face, his shoulder pads, and such. Once that's done, we're going to dry brush the whole model with Iron Breaker, including the hoses on the back, and make sure you're careful around the energy blade thing. And now with Skeleton Horde Contrast, we're going to apply that to his crown, his body, whatever these scales are. And then with the Guilliman Flesh and Technical Contrast Medium mix 1:1, we're going to apply this all over his body, except for the shoulder pads and face and such. We're going to apply it to 40 to 60% of the pieces of his body. Your choice, it could be the middle, the top, or the bottom. I use it on the bottom to match the artwork of the box and such. The bottom of each piece, his thighs, his legs, and arms and stuff. I then go back with some Agrax Earthshade and apply it to the tubes and stuff in the back, as well as his staff and his hands and that radiator thing on his blade and stuff, just to add some more flavor. Moving on to the glowy stuff. With Tesseract Glow, we're going to paint the rings around each of the glowy spots, the circle orbs, his eyes, the orb on top of his staff, axe haft thing, and his shoulder pads. Once that is done, with Moot Green, we're going to fill in all the orbs. With a 1:1 mix of Moot Green and Pallet Witch Flesh, we're going to apply this to 80 to 90% of the orbs, maybe even 100%. And then with a 1 to 2 Moot to Pallet Witch Flesh, we're going to apply this to the orbs. 60 to 70%, 60 to 80% of the orb, the most north raise area, will be painted this. And now finishing up some details, I'm going to use Ironbreaker and paint the links in between his, I don't know what these are, chains, necklaces, things. Also, the tubes on his arms, attached to his arms, and the staff and stuff, I paint Moot Green, and then the highlighted areas, the lighter areas are in the middle of the tube. I just forgot to film that. And then moving on to Caliban Green, I then use a very thin brush and I paint the insides of all the details of his glowing sword. Then using a 1:1 mix of Snarsnick Green and Pallet Witch Flesh again, I then paint all the edges. Take your time, a very thin brush, very simple, quick lines along the edges. I then go back with Caliban, Lauren Forest, Snarsnick Green, and I try to shore up the details with thin down, watered down stuff. The transitions are nowhere near as smooth, but the colors are much stronger. So, Airbrush is smoother, but small issue with the tape kind of screwed up things. After assembly, I noticed that the tubes in the middle of his chest are too bright, so I just apply some Tesseract Glow to bring them into line. And now moving on to the Skorpekh Lord, I actually knew his name. We're going to use Black Templar Contrast on all of his joints, the tubes, his spine, the ground beneath him, and such and such. Oh yeah, and that giant gun on his side, as well as the metal bits near the weapon. And using the 1:1 Guilliman Flesh and Technical Contrast, we're going to apply this to all over his body, except I think his shoulders, his face, like the pistons, and he has this skirt thing on the front. We don't apply that there. I forgot to film it, but with Agrax Earthshade we paint his head, his shoulder pads, that little skirt thingy in the front, and the metal of the pistons. And right after that, we dry brush the entire model except for his glowing sword and the stuff on his base, Ironbreaker. A light dry brush, by the way. Once that is done, we're going to take Agrak's Earthshade again, and we're going to apply one extra layer onto his claws. Now the gun got too much of a Ironbreaker highlight, so we're going to go back with Black Templar's Contrast watered down. One part Black Templars to 1 part water, and we're just going to apply this all over the gun to fix it. Now we're going to apply Skeleton Horde Contrast all over his body except for his shoulder pads, well, except for the crest on his shoulder pads. We're also going to apply that, we're just going to apply it all over his body except for the skirt, most of his shoulder pads. We're going to apply a little bit on his cheeks, but we're not going to apply any onto his claws. Moving on to the glowing stuff, and there is a lot. We're going to apply Tesseract glow all over his, the eyes, around the rims of each of the orbs. There's a bunch of them on his legs, his arms, his gun has a bunch. Then with Moot Green, we're going to go over and we're going to paint the entirety of each of the orbs this, 100%. And now with 1-to-1 Moot and Pallid Witchflesh, we're going to paint like 90 to 100% of the orbs. We're going to paint like 90% of the tubes on his gun. We're going to paint like the center 2/3 to 1/3 of each of his tubes that are on his back and such and such. Yeah, this is where you get to be a little artsy and you get to apply it. If some stuff spills over on the gun, no problem, you can just go back with some Black Templar's Contrast to tidy that up and such for all the other areas. And then with 1 part Moot and 2 part Pallid Witchflesh, we're going to paint the orbs and stuff, like 60 to 80% of them, the northernmost part with this mix. We're going to paint like the centers of each of the tubes this. We don't want that much, we don't want to overpower. And we're going to paint small thin lines and such onto his gun tubes. And yeah, his gun is glowing, so what can you do? Going back to his blade, with Caliban Green, we're going to fill in all these recesses. If a little bit spills over, we just brush it off with our finger. And then with 1-to-1 Snarsnick Green and Pallid Witchflesh, the superior white paint, we're going to do very fine edging on all throughout the blade. And with Mournfang Brown, after I attach all the models onto their bases, I use this to edge the plastic part of the base. The putty is so tall that it's actually noticeably higher than the rest, but I'm not going to paint that to Mournfang Brown. It's over. It's done. Finally finished the Indomitus box set. Except for the one that's coming at Christmas time, because I was a sucker and ordered it online from Games Workshop like everyone else, thinking that there'd be none at the store. But this Indomitus box set is done. Well, for some final thoughts. Overall, the box set is a combination of for people who are new to the game and people who are a little bit intermediate. It's mostly a beginner box because everything is pushed to fit, but well, a little irritating to paint some of the Space Marine guys. But as for these guys, so the bases are definitely improved upon, but there are some issues. So because of the putty and the nature of it, so some of these bases are, some parts are taller than the others, the bases are some like curved a little. That's because in the center of the putty, well, there's the most resistance, and towards the end I flatten it a little more is because I can't really regulate the pressure I put and there's less putty to put resistance. I'd have to build a tool to like easily roll the pin over the bases to make sure they're perfectly flat. But it's a little late for that until I want to get into Necrons again at some later date. But well, for right now, as far as the models goes, these are pretty simple, easy models to paint. The swords, which is the most interesting thing about them, so the airbrush did really good with transitions. The problem is that the tape, while it very good and very bad at the same time, it won't allow paint to flow in, but it has very weak grip, so it loosens up and then lets paint flow underneath it because it's not attached right. A mixed bag. As far as the models go, the edging on the swords took a while to get used to. You can actually see a progression from the Skorpekh destroyers to the Skorpekh Lord. I get better at it. Overall, like as a group rating, I would give myself 7 out of 10 on these guys. It's just simply because the bases are much better and I somewhat did well on the swords. As far as the Skorpekh destroyers themselves, I'd have to give myself a 7, just because the bases, it would normally be a 6, because the blades kind of fell through a bit. As far as the, I forgot their names, whatever. The guy with the weird, the guy who's pointing fingers and has a really long chin, the one with the bluish things, him, I'd give him an 8 out of 10, because more things went right than went wrong. As far as the commander guy with the halberd, I don't know why I called it a sword earlier, I'd give him a 7 out of 10. These are mostly because of the bases. It's just, I don't know, I'm just not fully happy with them. It's mostly because of the glowing swords things, like I wasn't able to do it as well as I thought. And as far as the Skorpekh Lord, I'd have to give him a 7 out of 10 too. His base is great. His sword, actually, you know what? No, I'm going to give him an 8 out of 10 because of his sword. He could have been a 9, but his gun, I couldn't really do it too well. It just seems a bit like lackluster compared to everything else. Like I couldn't really manage it right. The glowing and stuff, I couldn't do it as well as I would have liked to. He could have been a 9. Alright, so announcements going forward. So basically what's going to happen is I'm going to go back to my regular army and regular stuff. Now, the entire Indomitus box that I have built and painted, I'm going to be selling them because, well, I want the money so I can reinvest it into new Games Workshop stuff. I want to try my hands at some of those Age of Sigmar Lumineth Realm Lords. I want to try my hand at some of the new Space Marine stuff. Some of them, not all. Like some are just dumb. Like that turret thing, that's boring. I'm not going to touch that. So I'm going to be selling them, but I have 2 fully painted armies. So what's going to happen is I'm going to alternate between painting and battle reports. I'm going to do 3 battle reports in the vein of someone I used to watch for like 6 or 7 years ago, like 20-minute battle reports, just testing out. It'll mostly be me, a 40k noob, because I have not read 9th edition. I used to play 7th, and then I stopped. And so there's going to be 3 battle reports mixed in between painting things, and then once all the battle reports are done, the entirety of the Indomitus box that I've painted up is going to be sold on eBay. That's pretty much it. So look forward to it next. I'm deciding between my next video is either going to be the Glottkin from Age of Sigmar or some Pusguile Blightlords. One of those two. So, see you soon. That's it. Have a good day and hope to see you again.